All right, so we will conclude our program tonight with the summary remarks from the ideological leader of the Center for Political Innovation. He has inspired many people like me to do real life work and to not be contented in just hiding behind the keyboard. A unique political thinker, rich in depth and full of optimism. One of the kindest, patient, and honest man I've known. He does his utmost best to help people and to make this world a better place. Give your hands up to Caleb Maupin.
Thank you so much. Now stay standing and stretch. Please stand up and stretch. Just get a good stretch. Good stretch. Good stretch. I'll try to be brief because we're ending the program here tonight. So, just want to talk about a few things here. First off, I do want to thank Nick Brana for that great presentation. Tremendous. And I want to also thank Theo and Erebus, who are also from the People's Party. They came in. I want to thank the Uhuru movement. And people don't take seriously how serious the charges against the Uhuru 3 are. This is a really serious case. And the fact that they made the time to come here amid all that their organization is facing, we take that as a badge of honor. We are proud to stand with you, and we will be with you till the end. They should not be able to imprison anyone as a Russian agent for exercising their freedom of speech. We are on your side. Hands off, Uhuru. Absolutely. Chris Halali and I go way back. Chris Halali is great. He's from Vermont. Theo is also from Vermont, so they're co-staters. And Chris Halali, in addition to all the great things in his introduction, he's a farmer. Did you know that? We have the workers and the farmers represented here, so this is really, really great. Want to acknowledge Jose. You know, Jose, he has interrupted so many people. And some people said to me jokingly, they said, "Are you sure you want to invite that guy?" Then I said to them, I said, if Jose were to interrupt me in my speech, that would be like having like an expert opera singer get up and perform an orator. It would be like the best thing ever because he has done it so well. He has held the politicians' feet to the fire, and it would put me in some pretty big leagues with members of Congress and important people, vice presidents and others. So it would almost be an honor. So there you go, Jose. Really, really glad to have you here. And the Schiller Institute also has done so much to raise awareness about the Belt and Road Initiative. They were talking, a friend of mine years ago I was talking to about the Schiller Institute, and he said back in the 1980s they used to see election campaigns for their German political party. And they would be posters that were put up for their German political party, and it would have these high-speed trains going from China up into Europe. And people thought this was a crazy science fiction organization. What the hell is this, these trains? Well, now it's happening. It's actually happening. So that's some vision that I can respect. I also want to acknowledge, a couple friends that are here. Both Irving and Kevin, they're both former transit workers who came out tonight. So we love you, Irving. We love you, Kevin. Glad to have you here. And now Marnie. And that was a great presentation, Marnie. Marnie and I go way back to Occupy Wall Street. And Marnie was part of Occupy Wall Street. She wore a lot of crazy costumes back then, and she was part of the entertainment of Occupy Wall Street. What's so amazing is she kept protesting, and she kept doing things, even as so many people, when it stopped being trendy, when it stopped being cool. Marnie is keeping Occupy Wall Street alive, and every year she does an anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. Actually, I've had the honor of attending several of these anniversary OWS gatherings. So Marnie is keeping Occupy Wall Street alive. And, I came to New York City about 9 months before Occupy Wall Street. And I came to this city on a Greyhound bus. But I came to New York City from Cleveland, Ohio. And I had actually done some activism in Cleveland, Ohio, before I came to New York City. And in Cleveland, Ohio, there's an organization, I think it still exists. It's called Black on Black Crime Incorporated. And this is an organization that's led by Art McCoy, who's the owner of a barber shop in Cleveland. And this organization, Black on Black Crime Incorporated, it's kind of a black nationalist-oriented community empowerment group. A lot of ministers, a lot of Muslim imams, a lot of community businessmen and others. And I tell people that in a country where you have a real communist party or a real revolutionary organization, that's what it looks like. Because I would go to the meetings of Black on Black Crime Incorporated, and every week, Wednesday, they'd have like 80 people there. And they would talk about the stoplights, and they would talk about issues like rent rising in the community. They talk about garbage being collected. They would talk about all kinds of issues. And every week, it was like a citizens' power council in Nicaragua. It was like a Soviet, in the Bolshevik years. It was the community coming together to address the needs of the people. It was really a beautiful organization. And police brutality wasn't always a trendy issue to talk about. There has been a rise, Black Lives Matter, and what happened in Ferguson, and then what developed and later with the situation with George Floyd, and now it's something that a lot of people talk about. But it wasn't very trendy to talk about at one point. It was kind of an issue that the media stayed away from. Black on Black Crime Incorporated, it got us involved in some community struggles around police brutality that were pretty horrendous. There was one case, and this woman, young woman, 19, 20 years old, she'd had a little bit too much to drink one night, and her father didn't want her to get into the car, and so they had an altercation. The father called the police. The police showed up. One of them was on drugs at the time, and just beat the hell out of this woman. And then her mother stepped in to try and protect her, beat the hell out of her. And of course, they then charged them with assault on a police officer. And they said she tried to steal their firearm when there were no fingerprints on the firearm. And eventually these charges were dropped, but they spent 2-3 years in court. And year after year, court date after court date, just dragging it out. And the mother lost her job, and the daughter, was facing much more serious charges, and she's wondering, is she going to go away for 10, 15 years? And eventually, it gets to trial, and they drop everything, but they've already taken this family through 2 or 3 years of hell before they finally get to trial, and then they say, oh, okay, I guess we'll drop it down to nothing. That's how they operate. They destroy people's lives. They get people to plea bargain to things that they didn't do in order to make the charges go away. And I remember going to court with the family that was involved in that case, and seeing what they went through, and it was horrifying. And I mean, we were raising money so they could keep the electricity on in their house while they were going through this ordeal. The other thing is that it was through outreach around that particular case that I happened to be outside of Collinwood High School in Cleveland, which is a Cleveland high school on the east side. And I was outside of Collinwood High School, and the kids told me they were planning a walkout against teacher layoffs. And so me and my roommate, we went to that walkout that happened at Collinwood High School. And only about 9 kids got out the door because the police chained the doors to the school shut, which is completely illegal. And so they were kind of assembled outside, and then the police brutally attacked 2 young women, 2 sisters. And I was there, and I filmed it, and it was my video that actually got them acquitted in juvenile court after the police tried to charge them with assault on a police officer. And so I think about the issue of police brutality a lot. And, again, now it's trendy to talk about, but there was a time where certainly the black community was talking about it. People like Minister Louis Farrakhan were talking about it. The new Black Panther Party were talking about it. Communists were talking about it, but it wasn't a trendy issue. And that was the time when the rise in incarceration was happening, and the media was ignoring it. And that was also the time that the American people, first in California, got to know about this person.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, Kamala Harris, if you look at her career, her history is the history of mass incarceration. She was the queen of mass incarceration.
That's right.
People may not know the details, but Kevin Cooper was hours away from receiving lethal injection. Hours away from it. His lawyers asked that DNA evidence be acquired in order to make sure he was actually guilty of the crime. Kamala Harris's office tried to prevent DNA evidence from being acquired. They wanted Kevin Cooper to be executed, but the governor of California disagreed. They acquired DNA evidence, and the execution was stopped. Now that tells us everything we need to know about our vice president. The New York Times tells us that she feels really bad about it, for whatever that means. People can also recall that while she was head of the California State Attorney General's office, over 1,000 people were locked up for smoking marijuana. She presided over jailing a lot of people. And on top of that, the drug labs in the state of California that were being used by the police were turning up false positive results. They realized that the drug labs were showing people testing positive for drugs when they weren't actually, correct, that they were turning up false positives. And yet, Kamala Harris's office did not tell the defense attorneys or the judges about this. They knew that the drug labs were turning over false positives, and people went to prison because her office concealed that their drug labs were turning up false positives. And of course, when Kamala Harris was then asked if she'd ever smoked marijuana, she laughed about it.
They say you oppose legalizing weed.
That's not true.
I know.
and look, I joke about it, half joking. Half my family's from Jamaica. Are you kidding me?
You ever smoked?
I have.
Okay. Like
And I inhaled. I did inhale.
Okay.
But after Kamala Harris said, half my family's from Jamaica, what do you think, when asked about it, we heard from somebody that Kamala Harris rarely ever speaks about. And that's a man named Donald Harris, who is her father, who lives in Jamaica. And after Kamala Harris made those comments, Donald Harris gave a very brief statement saying that he denounced her presidential campaign. He called it a travesty of identity politics, and he said he speaks for her entire Jamaican family when he made this statement. Now, that did not get a lot of media attention. But somebody approached me, someone who knows Donald Harris, and said, Caleb, you really ought to look into this. So I started looking into this. What's particularly interesting is, you remember when Barack Obama was running for president. We knew everything about Barack Obama. We knew all about Barack Obama's pastor. We knew about Barack Obama's father from Kenya. We knew the school he went to in Indonesia. But Kamala Harris, barely anybody knows anything about Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is this mysterious figure. She was in California politics, first woman vice president, first woman of color vice president. We should just be happy about it. Nobody wants to really talk about these things. Well, Kamala Harris's mother, who's now deceased, was from India, was a cancer researcher. And Kamala Harris's father, Donald Harris, was a Marxist economist and is a Marxist economist, a professor at Stanford University. He was an advisor to the government of Michael Manley in Jamaica. And he and Kamala are estranged from one another. He did not attend Kamala's inauguration as vice president. They're not on good speaking terms. And another thing about Kamala Harris, I don't know if people saw, but there's a video of Kamala Harris where she's bragging about how she jailed the parents of children who were truant from school. Have you seen the clip?
I would not be standing here were it not for the education I received. And I know many of us will say the same thing. And I believe a child going without an education is tantamount to a crime. So I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy. Well, this was a little controversial in San Francisco. And frankly, my staff went bananas. They were very concerned because we didn't know at the time whether I was going to have an opponent in my re-election race. But I said, look, I'm done. This is a serious issue, and I've got a little political capital, and I'm going to spend some of it.
Wouldn't be anywhere in my life if it weren't for my education, and so not giving a child their education is a crime, and so I jailed parents, and she's giggling about it. It's just so great. And I see so much in U.S. media. They like to trivialize incarceration. There's so many shows on Netflix and all of that where it ends towards the end where someone goes to jail, but it's part of the happy ending. It's okay. And they don't seem to realize what that means. When one member of a family, when a father or a mother goes to prison, or a brother or a sister, it hurts the entire family. And when Kamala Harris is up there giggling about, I locked up these parents because their kids weren't in school. Yeah, kids need to be in school. The kids aren't getting to school, it's a problem. But the worst thing you could do is then throw their parents in jail. That's not going to help the situation in any conceivable way. But when she's joking about it, and she's laughing about it, Kamala Harris, she says, what did she say? She said, well, I wouldn't be anywhere if it wasn't for my education.
I would not be standing here were it not for the education I received.
It's about her. It's about her. And we all remember the big line when she was calling out Joe Biden, when she was trying to contend with Joe Biden in the presidential election. What did she shout at Joe Biden? She shouted, "That little girl was me! That little girl was me!" And then her campaign started churning out T-shirts with the face of 10-year-old Kamala Harris on them. Do you remember this? Yeah. Kamala Harris actually references her own childhood quite a bit throughout her speeches and throughout her campaign. It's very odd. It's very, very, very odd. Indeed, she's told stories, and it's almost like she wants us to vote for her because she was once a 10-year-old child. I mean, that's what it sounds like. But it's interesting, because there's a lot about Kamala Harris we don't know. She spent her childhood in Oakland, California. When she was a teenager, she moved to Quebec in Canada. She spent most of her teen years in Quebec. She says absolutely nothing about it. In her autobiography, she says nothing about the years that she spent in Quebec. She just talks about it as if it didn't happen.
And she doesn't know any French.
Well, there you go. But the more you look at it, it's very clear that Kamala Harris sees herself as a victim. The way Kamala Harris speaks, the world has been unfair to her. The world has treated her badly. She's had bad experiences in life. And she blames Donald Harris for that to some degree or other. We don't know why. We also, there's rumors, we don't really know what happened when she was in Quebec. We just know she never talks about the years that she spent in Quebec. But Kamala Harris thinks that she is a victim. And she wants the whole world to know that that little girl was her. And she wants vengeance. And she wants to make people pay. And she wanted to make Kevin Cooper pay. And she wanted to make those parents pay. And she wants to make people pay. And that's very, very clear when you listen to Kamala Harris. And that what's weird is that if you look at the Hillary Clinton State Department, you will find this exact same biography over and over and over again. If you look at the Democratic Party and the people that rise up its ranks, you'll see very similar personality profiles. Amy Klobuchar, her father was an alcoholic who beat up her mother. She's stayed with the mother. The father went away. She was estranged from the father. And she grew up to be a prosecutor who started putting people in prison. And Amy Klobuchar, one of her trademarks is that she would, when there was a black man on trial, she would hire these gang experts who didn't know anything about the case. They were just expert witnesses who would get up and tell stories about things that gangs do and scare the crap out of these jurors so they would convict this person. Right? Amy Klobuchar was very good at locking people up. But she also has a very similar life story to Kamala Harris. Estranged from her father, close to her mother. Samantha Power, same life story, very similar, right? Born in Ireland, her father was an alcoholic who beat up her mother. Her mother left Ireland, moved to the United States with young Samantha Power. Samantha Power's father died shortly afterwards. It's a similar life story. And what's interesting is that shortly before the 2016 primaries, as they got going, it became clear that Hillary Clinton couldn't run again. And so it's widely reported in the press that there was a meeting in the Hamptons where all the people who had been backing and urging Hillary Clinton to run again, they decided that instead of pushing Hillary Clinton to run once again, they would instead decide that they were going to put their money behind Kamala Harris. And Kamala Harris became the favored candidate of the forces who backed Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton, you'll recall, is the one who was running the U.S. State Department during the Arab Spring, the result of which was the destruction of Libya, the destruction of Syria. And you'll also notice that Tulsi Gabbard, who was considered a fringe candidate and not treated as a genuine candidate by the mainstream media, she used her very limited time on the debate stage, the little time she had, to go after Kamala Harris. Yep. And it was one of the most epic political takedowns that we've ever seen.
I want to bring the conversation back to the broken criminal justice system that is disproportionately negatively impacting black and brown people all across this country today. Now, Senator Harris says she's proud of her record as a prosecutor and that she'll be a prosecutor president, but I'm deeply concerned about this record. There are too many examples to cite, but she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Senator Harris, your response.
As the elected Attorney General of California, I did the work of significantly reforming the criminal justice system of a state of 40 million people, which became a national model for the work that needs to be done.
Bottom line is, Senator Harris, when you were in a position to make a difference and an impact in these people's lives, you did not. And worse yet, in the case of those who were on death row, innocent people, you actually blocked evidence from being revealed that would have freed them until you were forced to do so. There is no excuse for that. And the people who suffered under your reign as prosecutor, you owe them an apology. Our Democratic Party, unfortunately, is not the party that is of, by, and for the people. It is a party that has been and continues to be influenced by the foreign policy establishment in Washington, represented by Hillary Clinton and others' foreign policy, by the military-industrial complex and other greedy corporate interests.
But it's important to note also that Tulsi Gabbard, in addition to being anti-war, she's active duty U.S. military. And that when she speaks for more than herself. And her ability to be part of the political discourse and to raise opposition to regime change wars and to point out the Arab Spring and what it meant in spreading terrorism around the world, Tulsi Gabbard speaks for voices within what you might call the deep state. And that there's a real conflict within the deep state. That's very, very clear. There are forces within the deep state who disagree with each other. The ruling class are fighting with each other. And Kamala Harris represents one faction. And Tulsi Gabbard, Donald Trump, and other forces are tied to another faction. And this is something we can't just ignore. We can't pretend that these things don't exist. It would be nice to just be able to sit back and say, oh, they're all bad. But if you did that, you're not being serious in what you're doing. We have to be aware of the divisions in the enemy camp. And right now, there are divisions in the ruling class. When you think about Kamala Harris, and what she did as prosecutor, you could really just say that that's what leftism is if it's stripped of economics, if it's stripped of class struggle, if it's stripped of a desire to have the people rise up and control the means of production, if it's just anger, if it's just revenge, it's just a call for destruction, a call for rebellion, that's what Kamala Harris is. Kamala Harris, she's very much a guillotine meme. That's what she is. It's the glorification of punishment, a desire for revenge, a desire for destruction. And that if you look at the history of socialism around the world, the strength of socialism wasn't the guillotines, it wasn't the firing squads, it wasn't the persecution. That's not what people remember the strength of socialism being. They just did a poll. 75% of Russians say that the Soviet Union was the best time in their history, but they're not thinking that because of executions. I'll read to you what was said. This was from a PBS documentary. They interviewed a woman named Tatiana Fedorova.
Stalin set a task, build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible at one of the most difficult times to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. Because for us, Stalin was an idol.
Remember, we were illiterate. We lived in virtual darkness. We wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible to build all these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. And for us, Stalin was an idol. And the reason Stalin remains wildly popular in Russia, it's not because he executed people, it's because he mobilized them to build that country up from nothing. This was a country... He built some of the world's largest power plants. He wiped out illiteracy, and he built a modern industrial country. He raised millions of people up out of poverty. And then they fought off the Nazi invaders, and then they rebuilt the country again. And A few years later, they were the first country in outer space. And the strength of socialism was not that it punished people and that it persecuted people, but rather that it enabled people to go out and build and construct. Talk about Fidel Castro. The people loved Fidel Castro because of the executions and the persecution that happened in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. No. They loved Fidel Castro because he brought the people together to build a modern medical system, to raise the country up. He sent medical volunteers all over the world to care for people. And he sent literacy volunteers across the planet. That was the strength of Fidel Castro. You talk about what Kim Il-sung did. Why is it that Kim Il-sung is loved on the Korean Peninsula? Why is it that Kim Jong-un remains popular? Why is it the people of North Korea have not surrendered despite everything they've been up against? Well, it's due to the fact that after the Korean War, every single building in North Korea above 1 story tall was bombed and destroyed. The country was devastated. 4 million people were killed. And a year later, Kim Il-sung had every single child in the northern half of the Korean Peninsula back in school. And he built that country up. And he built up a steel industry. And he electrified the country. And the people saw their living standards rise and rise and rise. And that is the strength. And you can say the same thing about China. Poverty alleviation in China is a story that the United Nations and so many other countries have looked on. This is a whole country that moved up from nothing. We talk about the power plants that they built. We talk about the education that's been provided. We talk about the highways and the high-speed railway that's been constructed. But we can talk about even in the earliest years of the revolution. There were people who saw a doctor, millions of people, who saw a doctor for the first time in their lives because of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. Their barefoot doctor program sent doctors to remote regions, up into the mountains, places that had never seen a doctor. In addition to that, but there were children in China who had never seen the sun, because in China they had mines, and children are smaller and they can work in mines. And there were children who they would wake them up in the morning before the sun had come up and send them down into the mines. They wouldn't be allowed to come out of those mines until the sun had already gone down. They never saw the sun. And it wasn't until the victory of the Chinese Communist Party that they even saw the sun. You cannot underestimate the astronomical achievements of what socialism has done around the world. And when they hit us over the head with this story, this fairy tale that socialism never worked anywhere, I don't know what they're smoking. The evidence of socialism building and constructing and raising people up is absolutely massive. You can see it everywhere. But I'll tell you a couple interesting things. When the Chinese Communist Party was emerging during the 1930s, there was an American writer named Edgar Snow, and he went to China, and he wrote a best-selling book. It was a book that was a bestseller in the United States. It was called Red Star Over China. And he wrote about how the Chinese Communist Party and the Red Army, they had this spiritual power, this spiritual quality about them. People would give up everything they had and go and join the revolution. They would join arm in arm, and people, when you joined the Chinese Communist Party, you got a new name, and people didn't talk about their old lives, and people lived selflessly, and people from peasant backgrounds and people from very, very wealthy backgrounds would work together in the same organization. And it had this beautiful power to it. And if you read what was written by Edgar Snow, what was written by the American feminist Agnes Smedley, who went to China and also was embedded with the Red Army, many times in their writing they compare it to early Christianity. That's what they say. They compare it to early Christianity. And people forget that, but the book of Acts in the Bible, it says, referring to the early church, fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. And all who believed were together, and they had all things in common. And they sold their possessions and goods and parted them and gave them to every man as he had need. And they continued daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house, and they ate their meat in gladness and singleness of heart. And praising God and having favor with all the people, the Lord added to their number daily as they should be saved. It describes how the early Christian church was living together and sharing things and trying to build a mass movement. And if you listen to the teachings of Jesus, he's constantly warning his followers that they're going to face some persecution. They're going to face some persecution, and many of them did. We know what happened. But it was about living for something bigger than yourself, about sacrificing for your fellow human beings. You know, when we talk about persecution and cancel culture, there's a story that I always love to hear, and this is a really, really amusing story. When Mao and the Chinese Communist Party were expanding and fighting a civil war against Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek wrote, and he didn't personally write it, but he had his supporters write a song that they played on the radio constantly. And the lyrics translated to something that went along the lines of this: "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do?" And they played this song on the radio all the time. "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do?" And they actually made the kids sing it in their schools. "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are we going to do? When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are we going to do?" And it was everywhere. And people could not stand this stupid song that was constantly being played on the radio that all the kids were learning. And apparently, when the Red Army would march into a city and they would be victorious, the people would come out of their houses with tears rolling down their faces, and they would put their fists up in the air and they would sing, "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are we going to do? When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are we going to do?" They turned it into its opposite. And we will have that day in America. I don't know if anyone's ever heard, there's a song from the Civil War, about the Union Army when they liberated plantations in Georgia. It's called "Marching Through Georgia." I don't know if you ever heard it. One of the choruses, one of the verses: "There were many Union men who leapt with joyful cheers when they saw that honored flag they had not seen for years. Hardly could they be restrained from breaking forth in tears as we went marching through Georgia." And that was referring to the fact that back then the American flag stood for defeating slavery, and it stood for defeating the British Empire, and it stood for bringing people together to break their chains. Harriet Tubman became the first woman to ever lead soldiers into battle as she began liberating plantations along the Combahee River in South Carolina. In this city, the Republican Party newspaper, the New York Tribune, they hired Karl Marx as their London correspondent. That was the only jobs Karl Marx ever had, was to work for the Fox News of the 1860s. And he wrote about Abraham Lincoln as the single-minded son of the working class, rescuing an enchained race and leading people to raise up their heads, breaking the chains. And at that point, it was the British Empire that was trying to support the Confederacy. There was talk of the British Navy being sent to break the blockade and allow weapons and other things to get to the South. Well, let's not forget who sent their Navy to this city, to New York City's harbor. That was the Russians. The Russians supported Abraham Lincoln. We will have that day in America. Because I've heard the stories about how when Gus Hall and Bill Foster and the leaders of the Communist Party USA used to tour the South, and they would go to speak to crowds of tenant farmers. And in some of these states, they even had Jim Crow laws. They had to have a wire down the middle of the room because you couldn't have blacks and whites sitting together. And they would tell them about how their enemy was the big banks and how racism was a tool of the bosses. And I've heard the stories of how tenant farmers, low-income Southerners in Alabama and Mississippi would stand up and rip up their Ku Klux Klan membership cards and sign up for the Communist Party in those meetings. How powerful it was. And I've also heard about a generation later, when the Vietnam War was happening. It wasn't just hippies and the counterculture folks. There were young men from Wisconsin, young men from Iowa, good, wholesome Midwestern boys who went over to Vietnam, who came back from Vietnam and said that war was unbelievable, it was horrendous. They took their medals and they threw them over the fence at the White House. And they said, "We'll never make the mistake again. We will not fight a rich man's war." We will have that day in America. But the reality of the situation is that we're in a long-term capitalist crisis. I talk about overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profit and how they've built up their economic system. They've made it so efficient now to produce cars, to produce iPhones and iPads. They're churning out products like they never have before. And the role of the worker at the assembly line is being drastically reduced. They don't need us to run their factories anymore. And so we stand outcast and starving amid the wonders we have made. And their system is having a nosedive. It's having a meltdown. And the ruling class are fighting amongst themselves. And they're fighting against each other. And this is something that happens in a capitalist crisis. This is called Bonapartism, where the capitalist class divides, and they begin fighting with each other, and they want state power to stabilize the crisis, but they all want that state power at the expense of the other guy. They want protection. This is the division in the ruling class. And Silicon Valley and the big oil bankers are aligned with one faction, and there are other forces that are on other sides. And there's a fight in the ruling class. And January 6th was allowed to happen the way it did because there is a division in the ruling class. But I think what we need now more than ever is we need some of that classic American spirit. I've many times been in front of an audience and said, faster than a speeding bullet, faster than a locomotive, able to leap a tall building in a single bound, look up at the sky, it's Superman. That's right. And I tell people that not only is Superman identified with the United States around the world, but it's also pretty progressive. Superman, let's not remember that the first comic was him protecting a group of striking workers from their crooked boss, that Superman fought against the Ku Klux Klan in the comic books and exposed their secrets on the radio programs that happened. But there's something good about Superman. When you watch Superman, you feel good. There's an optimism that comes out of it. Superman could rule the world with his superpowers, but he doesn't. He lives a humble life as mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent. Superman doesn't like killing and violence. He's sickened by all the cruelty and injustice he sees in the world. He's an innocent, wholesome guy from Kansas who just wants to see people get along and just wants to protect those who've been hurt. There's something very, very beautiful, very, very beautiful about the Superman comics. I pointed out many times that Superman, the Man of Steel in Russian, that's Stalin. But I think Superman says a lot more about Roosevelt. And it says a lot more about the unemployment councils. It says a lot more about the trade unions and the anti-fascist progressivism of that period than it says necessarily about Stalin. It's about a side of the American spirit that they've been trying to crush, a side of the American people that believe in growth and optimism. And I think that what we need to do is we need to have a society that finds the Superman in every child, that finds the Einstein in every child. And I think that we will have that day in America. You look at all the money they spend on these wars, they could very easily be building high-speed railway. We could build high-speed railway all across this country. We could be putting all the brightest minds that are figuring out Wall Street derivative rip-off schemes and destroying people. We could put them to work, figuring out fusion energy, getting us beyond fossil fuels. Jose's guy, Lyndon LaRouche, there's one clip of him where he says, if we want to build 100 nuclear plants, we can do it. Understand American methods. Well, what are those American methods? That's that Superman mindset, that belief that we can go out and build a better world, that belief that we need to stand with the oppressed. And it's not a guillotine meme. It's not Kamala Harris. It's not vengeance. It's not woke. It's something else. It's optimistic. It's hopeful. And that is part of the American spirit. I think we could develop a social media app that makes people smarter, not dumber, that makes our kids more physically fit, more mentally healthy, gives them more hope. I think we could do a lot of things. But I was recently in a debate with some libertarians. It was hosted by the Convo Couch, and they were talking about the U.S. government and all the awful things it does. And they were saying, well, why would you want the government to expand? And I said, I want you to imagine that instead of having a government that gives Jeff Bezos whatever he wants and grinds this country into poverty, we had a government that was kicking Jeff Bezos' ass. Yeah. Imagine a government of action that would fight for working families. I've said to many people, I'm not a socialist because I want to destroy America. I'm a socialist because I want to save America. And we have to save America from the horrors that are being unfolded by an irrational system where profits come before people. I want to save America. I want to build a better world. If all the apparatus they've created for destroying people, for imprisoning people, for breaking people psychologically, could be utilized to build and to construct. If popular power were put in control of the means of production and control of the state apparatus of the United States, we could build something very, very beautiful. But that requires us to talk about a new kind of leftism. It requires us to not just go along with the crowd and go along with what's trending. It requires us to endure persecution, to buck the trend, to challenge the status quo. And it requires us to tap into that old American spirit. It says growth and innovation and hope. That's the American way. I'll just end tonight. There's a beautiful poem someone once recited to me. It went like this. On a busy street, on a busy town, I saw them tearing a building down. With a ho-heave-ho and a lusty yell, the men swung a beam and a sidewall fell. So I said to the foreman, are these men skilled, like those you would hire if you wanted to build? And the foreman just smiled and said, no, indeed. Common labor is all that I need, for I can easily wreck in a week or two that which took builders years to do. So I thought to myself, as I walked away, which of these roles have I tried to play? Am I a builder who builds with care, measures my life with a compass and square? Am I living my life by a well-made plan and striving to do the best that I can? Or am I that type that scours the town, content with the labor of tearing things down? Thank you very much.